calls himself the most pro-union president in history. But then why did he ban the railroad workers' strike? He swore to fight for ordinary Americans. So why did billions of taxpayers' dollars end up in the pockets of corporations? He promised to save democracy. Then why did his family make millions of the war in Ukraine? What is Hunter Biden's laptop hiding? Why did the FBI hide these files for 5 years? Who really runs America? Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. was born in 1942 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. This is an industrial city where the coal industry was the backbone of the economy for a long time. And unlike Trump, he does not come from a wealthy dynasty. His family belonged to the Catholic Irish community and was considered middle class. Although at times they experienced financial difficulties, Biden's father, Joseph Sr., at various times worked as a car salesman and also did other types of work related to physical and technical maintenance. His financial situation fluctuated. There were some relatively stable periods, but overall, the family did not have a steady income or influence. His mother, Catherine Finnegan Biden, was responsible for raising the children and played an important role in shaping her son's views. As he himself later claimed, she instilled in him resilience in the face of difficulties. The Biden family did not belong to the ranks of the influential or the wealthy. Their life was typical of the American working class in the mid-20th century. As a child, John struggled with a stutter, which made communication and school difficult for him. However, over time, he learned to cope with this problem, including through self-practice, and by regularly reading aloud in front of a mirror. In the early 1950s, after the economic situation in Scranton worsened, the family moved to Delaware, where Biden's father continued to look for work. This marked a transition to a more stable period, which allowed Biden to finish school, enroll in college, and later begin his legal and political career. Joe Biden's political career, which is already more interesting, wouldn't you agree began in the late 1960s in Delaware, when he was still a young lawyer with ambitions but without influential connections? In 1970, he was elected to the Newcastle County Council. This was his very first step into the world of public service. Biden quickly made a name for himself as a politician who was attuned to the needs of the local population. Despite not having a political dynasty behind him, 2 years later, he took a step that many considered far too bold. He decided to run for the US Senate from Delaware. At that time, he was only 29 years old. His campaign had a small budget, and his team consisted mostly of friends and family. Biden defeated the incumbent Republican senator, despite his limited experience. This result brought him national attention. He became the 5th youngest senator in US history. But before he even had a chance to take office, tragedy struck. In December 1972, his wife Nelia and their 1-year-old daughter Naomi died in a car accident. His 2 sons, Bo and Hunter, were seriously injured. This event nearly ended his career just as it was beginning. Biden seriously considered giving up his seat to be with his children. However, his colleagues in the Senate and his relatives persuaded him to continue. He was sworn in right in the hospital room next to his son Bo's bedside. For the following years, Biden commuted daily by train from Wilmington to Washington so he could spend evenings and nights with his sons. This daily commute is portrayed in the media as a symbol of his devotion to his family. He was even given the nickname Amtrak Joe Amtrak, being the name of the train he rode. And he has repeatedly mentioned how in his youth he witnessed racial segregation in Delaware. These observations shaped his political sensitivity to issues of social justice. He shared these kinds of memories in interviews, for example, with Vanity Fair and other publications. And overall, the media created an image of Biden as a wonderful family man and a very sensitive person. Perhaps that's true, but we won't stop at these complimentary stories, and we'll take a look at the political actions of the future president. Despite the tragedies and an unstable start, Biden managed to establish himself in the Senate, where he worked for more than 30 years, before becoming vice president and then president of the United States. After being elected to the US Senate in 1972, Joe Biden began a long political career that over the decades spanned a whole range of areas from foreign policy to domestic legislation. Becoming one of the youngest senators in history, Biden quickly drew attention as an active and ambitious legislator who was not afraid to take on difficult issues. Any reasonable person understands perfectly well that a career like Joe's, just a regular guy, can't be built without connections. In the 1970s and 1980s, many people helped him overcome his outsider status from Delaware. Here are the key figures who played a decisive role. First and foremost, it's the Biden family and local connections. Joe Biden's uncle, Edward Ed Blewett, was a World War II veteran and a respected businessman in Scranton. It was he who, in the 1960s, introduced his nephew to local politicians in Delaware, including leaders of the Democratic Party. His wife, Nelia Hunter, who died in 1972, also came from a well-known family in Wilmington. After the tragedy, sympathy for the widower with 2 children truly opened the doors of many influential households to him. Joe Mitchell is another person, a future leader of the Senate Democrats. In 1972, when 29-year-old Biden was running for the Senate, an advisor to the chairman of the Democratic Party convinced the national headquarters to allocate funds for his seemingly impossible, incredible campaign. And later, Mitchell became his mentor in Washington. Ted Kennedy, Robert DuPont, a patron in the Senate. After the election in 1972, Kennedy personally took Biden under his wing, despite the difference in their status. He brought him into the Judiciary Committee, where Biden earned his first real political capital. The DuPont lobbyists are yet another group of unofficial sponsors of Biden. The DuPont family, who controlled the chemical giant in Delaware, initially supported his Republican opponents. But after the election, Biden established a relationship with the lobbyists, especially with John Rawlings. This helped him secure funding for his re-election. And in the 1980s, Biden grew closer to Henry Scoop Jackson. He was an anti-communist senator. His connections with defense corporations such as Boeing and General Dynamics later greatly helped Biden strengthen his position on the Foreign Relations Committee. Why is this information important? Because these connections show that even this common man from Scranton, as Biden always portrayed himself, did not advance on his own, but rather through local clans of national power brokers and the defense industry. And even back then, he began building bridges with the military-industrial complex, and this ultimately shaped his policies in the 2000s. In short, in the Senate, he soon became a key figure in two powerful committees, the Judiciary Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee. As head of the former, he was involved in drafting legislation to combat drugs, violence, and crime. One of Biden's most controversial yet notable moves was his key role in creating and promoting the 1994 crime bill. This law provided for the expansion of the prison system, tough measures against offenders, and significant funding increases for the police. Despite its popularity among voters at the time it was passed, the law later faced sharp criticism. He has been accused of contributing to mass incarceration, particularly among blacks and Latinos. An equally important part of his senatorial career was foreign policy. Biden was one of the most active senators on the issue of U.S. intervention abroad. He supported the intervention in Bosnia in the 1990s, voted for the Iraq War in 2002, and then, in later years, actually expressed regret about that vote at least. That's what he himself said. This evolution of his position was presented by the media as a major advantage for a moderate Democrat who is capable of self-reflection but also willing to make political compromises. Throughout his time in the Senate, Biden built an extensive network of connections and became known as a politician capable of bipartisan agreements. He established working relationships with both Democrats and moderate Republicans. In particular, his alliance with Senator John McCain became a symbol of rare bipartisan solidarity on foreign policy issues. And despite his productive legislative work, Biden's political career was not without scandals. In 1987, his first attempt to run for president was accompanied by accusations of plagiarism. Journalists discovered that Biden had copied other people's words verbatim. And not just anywhere, but in his most important speeches. It turned out that such grandiose phrases about the legacy of miners and the dreams of ordinary people were borrowed from British politician Neil Kinnock without even changing the intonation.
But this standard is not a measure by which we can assess the state of our society. It cannot measure the health of our children, the quality of our education, or the joy of their play.
Nevertheless, the gross national product does not take into account the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play.
Let us promise that our generation of Americans will pay any price, bear any burden, accept any challenge, and overcome any hardship, regardless of the obstacles we face, to ensure and secure the blessings of prosperity and the enduring promise of opportunity for our children.
We will pay any price, no matter how great or demanding it may be, bear any burden, regardless of how heavy or difficult it becomes, overcome any hardship, no matter how challenging or daunting, support any friend standing by their side through every trial, and oppose any foe, no matter how formidable or persistent, to ensure the survival and ultimate success of liberty.
I started to wonder, as I was driving here today, why is Joe Biden the very first person in his entire family to ever have the opportunity to go to college? Why am I, myself, the very first skinnick in 1,000 generations to actually be able to go to college? Why is my wife, who is sitting right there in the audience, the very first in her family to ever have the chance to go to college? And why is Gladys, the remarkable Gladys, the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to go to university? Why is it, after all these generations, that we are the first? No, it's not because they weren't smart enough. It's not because they didn't work hard enough. It's because they didn't have a platform to stand on. Does anyone really think that they didn't get what we had because they lacked talent or strength or endurance or commitment. Of course not. It was because they didn't have a platform to stand on.
And later they found other borrowings, for example, from the speeches of Robert Kennedy. But that wasn't all. Biden liked to say that he graduated from university with 3 degrees with honors, presenting himself as a brilliant student. The truth turned out to be much more mundane. In reality, he was just an average student, not distinguished by any particular achievements. When the scandal broke out, Biden had to urgently withdraw from the election. Later on, he called all of this a youthful mistake. He claimed he simply didn't pay attention to proper citation. But the shadow of doubt still remained. At the time, it seemed like his career was over. However, history has shown that even such failures are not a sentence in American politics. In the following years, Biden was repeatedly considered a potential presidential candidate, but it was only in 2008 that he tried again to participate in the primaries. His campaign failed to gain momentum, but soon, he found himself in the spotlight when Barack Obama chose him as his vice presidential running mate. This role turned out to be a turning point. Biden became the link between the White House and Congress, especially during the economic crisis. He oversaw the implementation of the anti-crisis package and also served as a political advisor during discussions of complex international and defense issues. After 2 terms as vice president, Biden stepped back from active politics, but tragedy once again made him reconsider his future. The death of his eldest son, Bo, from brain cancer in 2015, influenced his decision not to run in 2016. However, in 2020, Biden ultimately decided to run for office, declaring his intention to restore the soul of the nation after Donald Trump's presidency. His election campaign relied on experience, moderation, and a promise of stability. After becoming president, Biden focused on combating the COVID-19 pandemic, economic recovery, and infrastructure investments. During his term, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was passed, under which the US invested more than $390 billion in climate policy. This is in fact the largest investment in the green economy in the country's history. As president, he also faced criticism and new investigations. In 2022, classified documents were found in his possession that were stored outside of a special archive, which triggered a Department of Justice investigation. Additional attention was drawn by an old accusation from former Senate staffer Tara Reid, who claimed that Biden harassed her in 1993. He denied the allegations, and there were no legal consequences. However, the incident became a focus of attention within the Me Too movement. Remember that? Let's take a closer look at his presidency. Whose interests does Joe Biden represent? Behind the rhetoric of being the savior of democracy lies an unseemly truth. The Joe Biden administration has become the perfect tool for enriching the corporate oligarchy. The numbers speak louder than any words. While ordinary Americans suffer from inflation and declining real incomes, the largest corporations and banks are receiving unprecedented government support. The financial sector was the first to open its wallet for the future president. In 2020, Wall Street invested $90 million in Biden's campaign. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Citigroup were among the main donors for a reason. Their investments paid off handsomely. But the real gold mine for corporations turned out to be the militarization of the economy. The record military budget of $886 billion for 2024 is not just a number, but guaranteed profits for defense giants. Lockheed Martin received $46 billion in government contracts in 2023 alone. Raytheon got $38 billion. The conflict in Ukraine has turned into the perfect business project. Of the $113 billion in aid to Kyiv, about 60% returned to the US in the form of orders for new weapons. And the large-scale AUKUS deal for supplying submarines to Australia will bring General Dynamics and Huntington a staggering $368 billion. The tech giants have also not been left out. The CHIPS Act, adopted in 2022 with a budget of $52 billion, essentially became a gift for Intel, TSMC, and Samsung. At the same time, Google and Meta spent $32 million on lobbying to block any serious antitrust initiatives. Artificial intelligence is a separate source of income. Through government programs, $1.5 billion in public funds have already been poured into OpenAI and Anthropic. Even the Green Revolution turned out to be a rebranding of old enrichment schemes. The Inflation Reduction Act, with its $369 billion in environmental investments, in practice means $9 billion in benefits for Tesla and $11 billion for NextEra Energy. But traditional oil companies aren't left out either. Exxon and Chevron received $6 billion for questionable low-carbon projects, which most often turn out to be nothing more than PR. Standing apart is the pharmaceutical mafia, which turned the pandemic into a gold mine. Pfizer made $100 billion from COVID vaccines and treatments. Moderna made $36 billion in net profit over 3 years. At the same time, Americans continue to pay 10 times more for insulin than Europeans. Lobbyists successfully block any attempts to regulate prices. On the international stage, Biden's policy is a classic imperialist game. Sanctions against Chinese semiconductor companies resulted in a 30% profit increase for Nvidia and Intel. The shutdown of Nord Stream 2, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, opened up the market for American LNG. The main beneficiary of this was cleaner energy. And the IMF and World Bank are siphoning off $120 billion from the economies of developing countries under the pretext of aid. And these figures paint a clear picture. The Biden administration is not a government of the people, but a board of directors for corporate America. And while 99% of the population faces growing inequality, the 1% of the super rich receive unprecedented government support. This is not democracy. This is the dictatorship of capital in its most blatant form, where every political decision has a clear price and a specific beneficiary. By the way, President Joe Biden has repeatedly spoken out in support of labor unions, emphasizing their role in strengthening the middle class and protecting workers' rights. He has even called himself the most pro-union president in history and has promoted legislative initiatives aimed at strengthening the position of unions. In his speeches, Biden emphasizes the importance of unions in creating jobs and developing the economy. He also calls for the adoption of the PRO Act, which would make it easier to organize unions and strengthen the protection of workers' rights. When Joe Biden ran for office under the slogans of protecting workers' rights, many believed that at last there would be a president in the White House who would truly stand up for ordinary Americans. However, the reality turned out to be much bleaker than the campaign promises. One of the first disappointments was the failed initiative to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. Despite loud statements, this project was thwarted not only by Republican resistance, but also by some Democrats. Restaurant chains, retail corporations, and small businesses all lobbied together against the increase, and as a result, millions of workers across the country were left with poverty-level wages that aren't even enough to cover rent. The collapse of the student debt forgiveness program was no less of a painful blow. The Supreme Court, where conservative justices appointed by Trump still sit, blocked the initiative, leaving millions of young Americans under the burden of debt. Instead of fighting for higher education reform, the administration practically gave up, offering no real alternative. Under Biden, the healthcare system has remained one of the most expensive and unfair in the world. Pharmaceutical giants continue to get away with inflating prices for essential medicines. The administration has not dared to take any radical measures, such as forcing price reductions or introducing public health care. As a result, millions of Americans still have to choose between paying medical bills and meeting their basic needs. But the most blatant example of betraying workers' interests happened in December 2022, when Biden personally intervened to ban the railroad workers' strike. Instead of supporting the workers' demands for higher wages and better working conditions, the president sided with the corporations by signing a law that forcibly ended the protest. This move revealed the true face of his administration when it comes to choosing between workers and business. The White House is betting on the latter. Even against the backdrop of a growing union movement, for example among Starbucks and Amazon workers, the administration limits itself to only symbolic support. There are no real steps being taken to make it easier to form unions. Instead, there are empty statements about solidarity, which are backed by neither political will nor concrete action. And all of this paints a discouraging picture. Despite the populist rhetoric, Biden has turned out to be a typical representative of the establishment for whom corporate interests always outweigh the needs of workers. The promise to build an economy for everyone has shattered against the harsh realities of capitalism, where profit comes before people and politicians are merely managers serving the power of money.
From the very beginning, I have stated clearly and consistently that the United States is absolutely prepared for any outcome, ready to respond decisively to a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Spring of 2014, Ukraine is in flames. Maidan, Yanukovych's flight, Crimea. But while the country is going through a coup, other questions are being decided in quiet offices. Who will get control over Ukraine's energy sector? It was at this moment that Hunter Biden, the son of then US, Vice President Joe Biden, suddenly became a member of the board of directors of the gas company Burisma Holdings with a salary of $50,000 a month. Hunter had neither experience in the energy sector nor any notable achievements in business. His resume included being discharged from the Navy for cocaine use in 2013, working at hedge funds and lobbying firms, and having the reputation of being the troubled son of a powerful politician. But Burisma, owned by oligarch Mykola Zlochevsky, was in urgent need of political protection. And a year before this appointment in 2013, the company was under scrutiny by the Ukrainian prosecutor's office on suspicion of money laundering and tax fraud. In 2015 and 2016, Joe Biden, as the overseer of Ukraine policy for the Obama administration, visited Kyiv multiple times. In December 2015, he openly stated Ukraine would not receive $1 billion in US loan guarantees unless it fired Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin. Shokin was at the time conducting an investigation against Burisma. A few months later, he was indeed dismissed. Biden himself later boasted about this in an interview with the Council on Foreign Relations in 2018. He says, "I told them, you will get the money only after he's fired." And he was fired.
And so I got Ukraine. I remember how we moved from the convictions of our team or other people to the belief that we should provide loan guarantees. And I probably went to Kyiv for the 12th or 13th time. And I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I got a commitment from Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, but they didn't do it. So they said they had taken action. They went to a press conference and said no. I said I wasn't going to do it. We are not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you don't have the authority. You're not the president. The president said so. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting that billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think about 6 hours went by. I looked at it. I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch, he got fired.
In 2019, President Trump demands that Zelensky investigate Biden's affairs in Ukraine. This conversation becomes the reason for Trump's first impeachment. The Democrats accuse him of blackmail, but the real bombshell goes off in 2020, when the New York Post publishes materials from Hunter's laptop. Messages where Hunter discusses with partners 10% for the big guy. Well, of course, it's clear that they're talking about Joe Biden. There were also photos with drugs, questionable parties, and documents about millions of dollars being transferred from China, Russia, and Ukraine. Facebook and Twitter block links to the article, calling it disinformation. 50 former intelligence officials signed a letter saying it looks like a Russian operation. As for Biden's financial interests, there is no direct evidence that Joe Biden personally received any money from Ukraine. But for example, Devon Archer, who is Hunter's partner, testified in Congress in 2023 that the elder Biden participated in calls with his son's business partners at least 20 times, and one Chinese company transferred almost $5 million to an account that was connected to Hunter. In 2022, checks were found showing that Hunter paid his father rent for a house using funds from Burisma. And with the start of the war in 2022, the topic of Burisma kind of faded into the background. But those rhetorical questions remain. Why was Hunter receiving millions from countries that his father was overseeing? And what happened to the $10 million that Burisma transferred to Hunter's company, Rosemont Seneca? And why did the FBI hide the data from the laptop for 5 years in the first place? This isn't the only scandal. There were others as well, which were connected to black people who, according to Biden, were supposed to vote for him. And what do you think about this whole pack of transgender freaks who held key positions in various organizations under Biden? And in recent years, Joe Biden has given viewers plenty of amusing moments that the whole world has watched over and over. And of course, this is related to Joe's health. Undoubtedly, the very fact of cognitive impairment is not a reason to laugh at a person. But when this person is elected president of the most powerful country in the world, it becomes frightening for the state of the country's political elite, who couldn't put forward at least a capable person for the position of head of state. He makes mistakes, he forgets things, he loses track of the conversation. But there is one thing he remembers perfectly well. He knows exactly whose interests he serves.